The rule of law has declined globally for 7 years in a row. The Rule of Law Index, produced and published by the World Justice Project, found that in 57% of the countries it surveyed, or 81 countries out of 142, the rule of law weakened between 2023 and 2024. And that's not even including Trump 2.0. Why is there a global rule of law recession? And what can be done to break out of it? Hi, I'm John Nery, and you are in the Public Square. We are less than 2 weeks away from the midterm elections, but it is also important to situate ourselves in a global context. Beyond the dynastic struggle between the Marcos and Duterte families and their various proxy wars, global trends impacting on the Philippines are continuing to play out, such as a rule of law recession. We are joined today by Dr. Alejandro Ponce, the Executive Director of the World Justice Project. Dr. Ponce, a PhD in economics from Stanford and the longtime Chief Research Officer of the World Justice Project, is currently on a 3-country swing through South Korea, the Philippines, and Thailand. I am very happy to have been able to catch him at this time. Welcome, Dr. Alex Ponce, and thank you for joining us in the Public Square.
Thank you very much, John, for having me.
Let me begin by making a full disclosure to our audience. I am a member of the Board of Directors of the World Justice Project since 2018. But that only means that I know for a fact that Dr. Ponce knows the Rule of Law Index inside and out. Alex, let me start by asking, why is there a rule of law recession worldwide?
Well, first, let's talk about what the rule of law is.
Okay.
I know that the audience and in your show, you talked about this, but it's useful sometimes to remember what the rule of law is. And in very plain language, the rule of law is these governance systems in which people and governments are accountable on their laws. And there are some basic principles for those laws that the laws apply equally, are adjudicated fairly, and so on. So that essentially just the different people and different members of society, including authorities, are just comply and are applied or are held accountable under the laws. So as you can imagine, it's really hard to assess this overall. Just we can think about a lot of different situations. The law applies to really just a lot of the different areas just of our lives. Not only just what the authorities are doing, but really what regular people are doing. And in order to do that, to talk about a global rule of law recession, we really need to think about just what are the day-to-day situations that people are facing, as well as what the governments are doing, and that somehow has an impact on people's lives. And somehow this is something that we have been trying to do over several years to quantify these situations through the Rule of Law Index. The index is a tool that tries to capture all of these situations, asking people around the world, just organize several questions so that we organize in different indicators that in the end can help us quantify this rule of law recession. So broadly speaking, there are, let's say, on one hand, areas that capture whether governments are held accountable, whether there are enough checks and balances or absence of corruption, open government, or the protection of fundamental rights. And in another set of indicators, capture whether indeed citizens obey the law or are held accountable under the law, and then ultimately when there are disputes, that the disputes are resolved in a peaceful manner. So issues about regulatory enforcement, security, or justice. So we develop questions to quantify these around the world, and we have been doing this for several years. And this allows us to see, as you were mentioning before, that overall, just when we look at this over several years, we have seen that the rule of law globally has been declining. For several years already, for 7 years in a row, what we have seen is that more countries have declined than improved. Obviously, this has changed over the years. Sometimes more countries declined than improved. During the pandemic, we saw probably the largest difference between countries that declined versus those that improved. But this is a trend that we have seen. And obviously, this is dynamic. Some countries suddenly just improve when there are changes in administration, or not necessarily decline every year in a row. But this is, overall, it's a global trend. And we have identified, when we look at all these indicators, three drivers of this rule of law recession. So one has to do with checks and balances, just a rise in authoritarianism. So what we mean by that is, in all the systems of governments, there are checks on the power of authority, limits on the power of authority. And these can come from laws, but they can also come from other authorities, either legislator, the judiciary, oversight bodies, or even the press. Just not necessarily all of them need to be state-driven, but even the press or the public. And something that we have seen is that there has been a decline, let's say, on what effectively these institutions or authorities can do, the exercise of power that they have, the control, the check that they have over the executive has diminished. In some cases, this has been driven by some actions of the executive to diminish effectively the power of some of these authorities. In some cases, through changes in laws, changes in legislation, or even sometimes just attacks, speech, and so on, that somehow try to diminish the authority of the check. So this is something that we have seen around the world. It's a big decline and has been constant. Another area, just probably the second driver, is a decline in fundamental rights, which is somehow related to this first element that we saw. And it's, I mean, when we think about the basic political and fundamental freedom, something that we have seen as well around the world is a weakening of these fundamental freedoms. When we talk about freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, just which is the core of the civic space, discrimination in some cases against some vulnerable groups. This is something that we have seen as well that has weakened in many countries over the years. Perhaps in some cases associated with the first driver, just the rise in authoritarianism. Obviously, it's what we're seeing is an attack not only against some of the checks, the governmental checks, but also against some of the restriction of the liberties of what civil society can do, non-governmental organizations, the media, even political parties. So this is a second driver that we have seen as well. And finally, the third driver, which is justice. Something that we have seen is that around the world, justice systems are not fully delivering. Just there are, in some cases, declines, in some cases driven. Obviously, the pandemic had an effect on this, but and in some countries there was a rebound just after the pandemic on how they deliver the services. But overall, something that we see is that many people who indeed have legal problems, who need somehow the justice system, may not necessarily be able to access it. So the courts, in many cases, are foreign to the people. Just only a small number of people are able to access the courts. And still, we see just that many of the problems that people may have go unresolved, whether it is civil or criminal. So that's the third factor.
I was going to ask you if we can go through each of the four universal principles that the WJP definition of the rule of law uses: accountability, open government, just law, and accessible and impartial justice. But maybe we can use the three factors that you pointed to instead. So checks and balances, fundamental rights, and justice.
Right.
Would it be correct to say that there has been a decline in each of these three over the last 7 years? Or you were really looking at checks and balances, or just fundamental rights, or just access to justice? Or is it across the board?
Most of the decline has been in checks and balances and fundamental rights. So what we have seen is a rise in authoritarianism around the world. The tendency accelerated during the pandemic. You may remember that many countries imposed restrictions on civil society and took, let's say, additional, increased their power to a certain extent. And in many cases, even after the pandemic passed, those those wrapping of power didn't really diminish. So in some cases it did, but in some other cases, particularly in some just countries that have autocratic tendencies, didn't really diminish. So this is one of the main trends that we have seen. Of course, the justice is somehow related, but not all the countries that experience this a decline in these first two elements have experienced a decline in justice. Now, obviously, this is talking about global trends, but just not all the countries are doing exactly the same. And we can identify, if we look at this in the last few years, we can identify probably three buckets of countries. So in some cases, the first bucket is countries that already were autocracies and that have become more autocratic.
Okay.
So in these cases, the decline is more accelerated. If we think about growth rates, the decline is has been more negative. The growth rate has been more negative. And usually it's not only in these areas that we were mentioning before, but it's across the board. So usually we see a deterioration as well in justice, in just the enforcement of laws and so on. Just states that are autocratic and are not fully delivering.
Okay.
In the second bucket, what we see are states that were just from the outset had higher levels of rule of law, but that have experienced a decline in rule of law and driven mainly by these points that I was mentioning. So attacks on the judiciary, in the legislative branch or the oversight bodies really just becoming more autocratic. In some cases, this happens over a few years and then they bounce back. So when there are changes in administration, just sometimes we have seen that, and there are some examples that we can that we can think about. So in those cases, the decline has been as extreme as those in the first part, in the first bucket. So the growth rates, the negative growth rates are more moderate, but still we're seeing a decline. And this is where a lot of the countries are, just the countries that have decline in rule of law, most of the countries are in that, no? And they are across the spectrum of rule of law. In some cases, we have seen countries with high rule of law that have been declining. In some of the countries that started in the middle that have been declining as well. So it's not really just only countries that already had low rule of law as those in the first group. And then in the third part, we see countries that indeed have improved. So there are some countries, and probably we can see three types of those countries. So some countries in Europe that have been improving. Then there are some countries that, particularly countries in Central Asia that have come from closed countries that are opening up for reforms. And there are as well some countries that are in the neighborhood of the European Union that want to just access the European Union, and then as a result are pursuing reforms to improve their governance systems. So then these are the three groups. Obviously, just the dynamics change in each one of these groups, but this is related to the two areas, the two fundamental areas that we discussed before.
I wanted to know, is it possible to speak of a historical moment? Are we going through a particular pivot in history, which explains why there's the continuing decline over 7 years in rule of law factors? Or would it be attributable, the decline be attributable to other causes? I'm aware that the World Justice Project is about 15 and a half years old. So the Rule of Law Index is also about the same. So about half of the lifetime of the Rule of Law Index has been the last 7 years. And we've seen this decline. Is it because we're going through a historical moment? Or is it because of, I don't know, improvements in measuring? I think you track a total of 44 factors or something.
Yes. This is a good question. Probably the best way to answer is in terms of long-term trends.
Okay.
So a long time ago, just the 90s and 2000s, we experienced this democratization wave in which there was an improvement. Just many of the countries that were coming from the Soviet era that just opened up and improved just their governance systems. Many of them enter into the European Union, and we saw this tendency of improvements in democratic governance and in rule of law. This is something that we saw until probably the 2010s, and that is at that time when we start seeing a decline in some countries. First, just some signs just in some countries in Europe. In some countries, you may know, of course, just some of the cases in Poland, Hungary, Turkey, and so on, as well as some countries as well, just in the just old Soviet sphere that started to decline. So then we start seeing a little bit of that decline in the 2000s, in the 2010s, 2015. And this is something that we also start seeing in the index at the beginning of, between the 2010, 2015, we were seeing some countries were improving, some declining, but we couldn't really talk about a global recession. It is in 2015 when we start seeing that global recession. And again, just following this tendency that I mentioned before, in which some countries that were already autocratic start becoming more autocratic, you know, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and so on, and as well as countries that started this tendency to become more autocratic, you know, at the time, just some countries in Europe as well, and in Asia. And then, and at that time also something that we saw was a change in some countries in which suddenly just leaders with populistic anti-system tendencies starting to come into power. And this is something that we saw. And in many cases, just rising under these platforms, and when they arrive to power, they starting attacking just institutions and the checks and balances and so on. In some cases, just the situation in those countries, these are countries that are not necessarily autocracies already. So there are already some checks and balances, and in many cases it takes time to dismantle them. In some cases, these governments came with big legislative approvals, of which obviously worsen some of the tendencies. But in some cases, there was pushback just immediately after several administrations. And this is something, or one administration, and then there are pushback. And this is something that we have seen in countries all around the world, just in Asia, Africa, Latin America, in which somehow there are changes in administration, there is pushback and so on. In some cases, no. In some cases, the tendency continues. Some cases under the same leadership. In some cases, under a party leadership of different people. But this is something that we're seeing. Now, to your question on whether it's a historical moment, certainly it's something that it's a tendency that we're seeing. It's unclear whether the wave is going to reverse. What we are seeing is that the trend worsened during the pandemic. The pandemic was a historic moment that just helped somehow worsen these autocratic tendencies. This is the year in which we saw the largest difference, in which most countries declined in rule of law. About almost 80% of the countries declined in rule of law during the pandemic. But then later, just that rate started to diminish. So today we're seeing that about 59% of countries decline. So that just, we moved from that 80% to 59. Still, the rule of law is declining. More countries are declining than improving. But the tendency that we're seeing is diminishing. Similarly, there are, again, not all the factors, as you were saying, or the indicators function the same or are moving in the same way. Something that we saw, for example, last year was improvements in corruption or in anti-corruption also, just in which more countries improve their scores than worsen. This is something that usually in corruption doesn't move by a lot. So just it's not that we see just a global tendency to improve or worsen corruption. But in last year, we start seeing some improvement. So this is dynamic. So to think about a historic moment, well, countries are moving differently. Of course, we could say that just given all that we're seeing in terms of autocracies learning from each other and the tools that sometimes we hear that they use that are very similar in different countries, just these modern tools just for just going against civil society or the media or some of the checks. I mean, this is something that obviously the information is more spread out, and this is something that we can that we are seeing replicated in different forms in different countries. But at the same time, also something that we're seeing is that civil society in some cases is more active and so on, and lessons that we see in one country are learned in another, and in many cases there's pushback. No, just particularly just when either in some countries that come from a negative tendency, and which, but there are still somehow institutions that allow for elections and so on, and that there's pushback. Obviously, this becomes more difficult as the countries become more autocratic, because then the state is more captured and it's more difficult to fight back, and that's probably the challenge and why it's necessary in many cases just to fight this just from the outset, and just this is up to societies. No?
Is there an indicator that can herald the biggest decline in a country's rule of law index, like the reddest of red flags? If we just confine ourselves to that second bucket of countries, those with rule of law regimes and so on, but have declined, is there a particular indicator that really should set alarm bells off?
Usually it's either the checks and balances or the fundamental rights. I think the fundamental rights speaks about the closeness in civic space that somehow signals all of these. There are indicators that are more related. There are some indicators that are more related to state capacity in many cases, and that are more difficult to change, either for the positive or the negative. Just when we talk about the performance of justice systems, this is something that is really hard to change, or the performance of regulatory agencies. It can deteriorate quickly, particularly when there are movements just in the agencies and so on. But usually improvement is tough. Just deterioration in some cases, except perhaps on indicators on judicial independence and so on, but usually just the day-to-day cases, I mean, they function just again.
If a government were to suddenly cancel regularly scheduled elections, say we're not going to have elections this year, how would that impact on that country's rule of law measures?
Well, there are indicators on elections, just of course, and that is one of the fundamental checks. I mean, just as you know, just is a key part of accountability. So that will be immediately reflected, just that pure action, as well as obviously indicators on just the civic space and fundamental rights. Obviously, a movement like that will bring consequences as well, no? Because usually just what society will react and so on, and that usually is followed by either doubling on that and then closing the civic space even more, and as well as different legislative bodies. Usually something like this, or oversight bodies, if something like this will come, usually will be taken to courts and so on, and then there is just a sequence of events that will unfold, and that's just something that we, when we think about checks and balances, really those are the institutions that are in charge of avoiding something like that or fighting back when something like that will happen.
Still on the topic of elections, last year, 2024, I think was the year the most number of people went to the voting booth.
That's right.
All over the world. Are there any findings in the WJP Rule of Law Index for 2024 that were impacted by the elections?
Yes, you're right. The last year was a year in which the most election happens. The 2024 index was collected at the time in which many of these elections happened. So it's hard to say just if we think about what's the result in terms of rule of law, that of the new governments that were elected, that they're more autocratic or not, and so on. This is still something that we will learn this year when we collect the information. But something that we saw usually is that, as you were saying, just the states that have more rule of law usually just have a stronger election. So that's a result that we have found. And usually, when you have a stronger rule of law and stronger elections, there is a higher likelihood that there is a regime change. Which makes sense. So because in many cases, when there are just autocratic states, just the electoral system is captured, and then as a result, there is a less likelihood that there is a change in regime. But really the findings just for how the outcomes of those elections is something that we will learn this year. We're collecting currently the information around the world to try to answer that question.
I asked the questions about the elections because I was thinking that might be the reddest of red flags. But what I'm getting from you is that perhaps there is no one single indicator that will be, the most that will send the most dangerous signals. It will depend on a particular context. It could be that in one case, all of a sudden the Supreme Court has been co-opted. There's a capture of the judiciary, or in another country it would be a super majority in the legislature, or in another country, you can no longer demonstrate in the streets. It might depend.
That's right. It's the system of checks and balances it varies by country. Just usually when we see declines in those checks and balances, we see them across the board, but it takes different shapes dependent on the current context of the country, and not only necessarily the attack, let's say, on these oversight bodies, but also the reaction of that. Something that at the end of the day, what we're seeing is an equilibrium, but really just the action happens just on a daily basis whenever there are attacks, and then just when something is taken to court, and then the court responds, and then there is a ruling, and then just perhaps just the executive may not comply with the ruling, and so on. Really, it's just a contested space.
Sure.
That really just is a reflection of the strength of the institutional system. Obviously, that contestation is less likely to happen whenever just some of those oversight bodies are more either threatened or captured, or just have fear, or there's violence. Depending on the country, and not necessarily only perpetrated by the state. It's by other actors. So, but overall, it's really just an issue of contestation, and because of that, it can take very different forms, even just same actions by the executive, depending on how it is contested. And in many cases, it's just by actions, small actions, just by one political party, by one media outlet, just that may determine the final outcome, just whether something that is the same type of action may pass or may be rejected or circumvented. So.
Every few years, the World Justice Project hosts the World Justice Forum. This year, it will be in June in Warsaw, Poland, and the theme, I think, is standing up for the rule of law. Can you give our audience an idea of what happens in a World Justice Forum and what to expect from this particular forum?
Yeah, the World Justice Forum is an event that we organize every 3 years. The intention is to bring together the community supporting or trying to strengthen the rule of law in their countries. This could be obviously government, non-government organizations, private sector, academia, to a global gathering. Usually is around a theme in which we exchange ideas, try to make commitments as well on how it's not simply talking about it or exchanging ideas, but really how we want to commit to advancing it and really building the collaborations and the strategies for doing that. And that's really just what is at the core of the World Justice Forum. This year, we're doing it in Poland. Poland, and the theme is, as you said, standing up for the rule of law. Really, the intention was, given all these trends that we have been talking about and that we have seen, really asking ourselves, what can we do about it? How can we fight this back? How can we get together to really think strategies to do that, think creatively, just from colleagues, partners in different parts of the world? We selected Poland. You know Poland was a country that experienced a recession, but came out of that recession recently. Just a new government was elected, and there are some changes that have been made to try to fight back some of the changes that reverted some rule of law outcomes. So that's why we're meeting in Poland to also try to learn from the Polish experience and really just exchange those ideas, just so that people in other countries, just again, just from different stakeholders, learn from it and get inspired and make commitments to advance.
What can other countries learn from Poland's example in emerging from a rule of law recession? Again, of course, circumstances will vary, but maybe you can point to certain factors.
Yeah, I think the first one is that, as you were saying, elections are very important. So the very first thing that is needed is the largest change that we see, and this is not only in Poland, but in countries that have bounced back from this recession, is when there are changes in administration, when there is a new government that comes, and usually for that, you need elections. So that is the first thing, just that the public just stands up and says, that's enough. Usually it's the rule of law is a theme amongst many others that influence the people. In many cases, it's not people vote not only for rule of law, but for economic reasons. And so there are a lot of different aspects just that influence just people's voting choice. But one of them is that one. First is standing up and really just that the people just make their voice heard and then stand up. And obviously there are strategies just for making this happen. But then once there is a new government, I mean, it's challenging still. It's not that straightforward. Once you may have a new government who may be willing to reverse some of these trends, but in many cases, there may not necessarily have just a majority in Congress or in the parliament, and somehow just pick the political momentum to try to reverse some of those trends. That's something that Poland is currently doing. Just in the case of Poland, there were captures of the judiciary, attacks to the judiciary independence that the previous administration did, and this is something that Poland is trying to currently reverse, just with some challenges as well. It's not that easy. But again, the most important thing is probably just the organization of the public, of the civil society, and there are different stories just on how the Polish civil society organized. Brazil is another case just with Bolsonaro on how the civil society organized really coalitions of civil society organizations to defend the vote, to just in cases in which, in the case of Brazil, for example, was contested, just take it to court, and then just support the processes so that it could follow its route. So there are some strategies, particularly around the electoral process. So that's why it's so important and so timely to think about these issues.
Is there a successful example of a country breaking out of a rule of law slump without a change in government? Usually the most important cases come from that, but there are some others, and usually those cases are either because there are huge reform efforts to really improve the rule of law. There are some cases, just I was mentioning before, some of countries in Central Asia. There are some countries in Latin America as well. In which there are reform efforts. There are reform efforts as well when countries have incentives, for example, to join the European Union. Many of the countries around the neighborhood in Europe, they have strong incentives and mechanisms for trying to advance the rule of law. It's difficult, as you can imagine. Just strengthening institutions is quite difficult. And if we look historically, there are only a few countries that have been able to do it successfully and constantly over several years. And really just the stories change from one country to the next, but usually it's the commitment. I mean, the story behind is the commitment of indeed improving the rule of law and putting the state apparatus and the political will around it just to do it. As we know, changing rule of law is political, just at the very essence, because it's really at the core, going back to the definition that we were talking at the beginning. It's about limiting the power, it's about just holding authorities, people accountable. So, and in many cases, just that's not something that governments may want to do. They may not want to restrict or limit their own power, and that is obviously that's why it's so difficult in some cases to do that. No, and this is true when we talk about the rule of law, when we talk about anti-corruption, when we talk about judicial independence, and so on, because somehow it's a way of
trying to put some limits and to be held accountable against some other bodies. So it's challenging. So that's why in many cases it's so important that there is this political will and all the mechanisms in place. It's not only political will, but really just trying to institutionalize that through laws and strengthening of the institutions. Otherwise, it's just after the next administration, then we go back to where we were. So it's really an effort to institutionalize that and to just building the institutions so that the power is not in the individual, but really on the institutions.
But if I understand you correctly, political will is not only exercised by the government, right? I mean, our own definition of rule of law includes, other institutions, norms, right? And so civil society organizations, right?
That's right. So usually, you're right. The government has to play an important role just because of how it is, and there are mechanisms. Just if we think about strengthening institutions or building legislation and so on, all of that has to be driven somehow by champions in the government. However, they are not the only ones. I mean, there are still, and this is something that we have seen as well. There's actors in civil society, as you were saying, that has somehow either exert pressure or sit at the table just with proposals, just being developing really just initiatives, really being just proposing or generating political pressure in some particular instances that can help indeed move sometimes or generate momentum for change. So definitely is something that it's important. Is something that in some cases, unfortunately, there are countries in which we don't necessarily see that, and that obviously has an impact because that empowers just whoever doesn't want to do anything just with the status quo. So it's the role of the media, the role of civil society, the role of the opposition parties as well in keeping this in the agenda, in talking about these issues and putting some proposals is quite important. And as I said, just this is a contested space.
I just remembered that the previous Philippine administration, the Duterte government, actually included a couple of measures from the World Justice Project as part of the long-term Philippine development plan. Every administration has a development plan. If I remember correctly, one of them was like we should be in the top quartile or something like that, right? But of course, the former president is now at The Hague. There have been violations of that. I guess what I wanted to raise here was that should we, instead of asking governments to enshrine or encode rule of law index measures in their development plans, maybe it should be like a greater community, so there you have government, you have civil society, you have universities, that sort of, and then they agree. Okay, we would like to be, in the top 25% now, no longer in number 80 or whatever.
This is a very good point, and it goes to the previous questions. You're right. I mean, we need that initial push, but really for this to move forward, or the best way to move forward is when you build these participatory processes, when you find ways to co-create these initiatives, when you just put together a plan. I mean, as you were saying, just with civil society, opposition, academia, and so on. Those are usually the initiatives, and this is something that we have seen as well. When those initiatives happen, they tend to stick. They usually are the most robust ones, and because it really involves the change of different parts of society and a commitment from different parts of society of moving forward. I mean, the challenge is really to keep that commitment, because it's sometimes easy just to build that momentum, just to do something, but really just to keep it forward, because obviously there are incentives in some cases to, well, we passed it already, and then just we deviate. No, but you're right. This is something that it's important and that it's key to. Just to advance governance and the rule of law, and this is usually in cases in which we have seen historically countries that have advanced. Usually it's because there has been some movements or just of this type after some events and so on, in which there is just really just a whole society approach.
I don't want to put you in the spot, but maybe we can I can ask you for some general guidelines. As far as the United States is concerned, what should we look out for? What are danger signs that we should be monitoring? The rest of the world looking on.
Well,
in terms of rule of law, of course.
Yes, this is obviously where we know that we are at a historical moment just on what has happened. I think the current administration obviously has disregarded the rule of law domestically, but importantly as well, just what we have seen with just the stop and work orders of USAID and so on, really just and the changing narrative that we have seen over the previous couple of months is that there is this commitment of the U.S. to support democratic values around the world and support the rule of law may not be there anymore. There may be some aspects of the rule of law that may be willing to support, but that broader agenda of supporting the rule of law globally probably is not there anymore. And just obviously we'll have to think about what's going to be there instead.
Sure.
So, and to a certain extent, it will be up to the countries, to look up for themselves and to try to advance the rule of law domestically. But that change, that obviously that's what's happening is changing the world order. We'll need to see what will happen with the U.S. So I don't think that that we will see moving all the way to the other direction. Again, the U.S. is a country that has strong institutions, and a lot of what we're seeing today in the U.S. is a contested space in which many of these the executive orders have been contested in courts, and it's and which speaks about some of the strengths of the institutions, but it's something that it's evolving. Also, just we'll have to think about how that vacuum is filled just by other players, whether the European Union is going to play a role or they are looking more domestically now. They are still committed to democracy, but there are some threats as well in Europe, just from the far right, that the EU has to come into terms with. So, as well as some other countries, that in different regions there are different players, but it's just we will have to see how eventually that plays out. But something that it's true regardless is that the U.S. have signaled probably, if not just a tendency towards not supporting or not necessarily promoting democracy or democratic values and the rule of law as they used to do in the past.
I also have another question about this time about the other superpower. I can't help but note that our definitions of rule of law seem to be country-based. A lot of it is domestic. I'm wondering, in the space between countries, how can we enforce rule of law? I don't think the Rule of Law Index monitors that, right?
Yes.
If the South China Sea disputes will follow this. Is there a way? How should we start to think about extending the rule of law to even international relations?
That's a great question. I'm not an expert in international law, but it is from the people that I have talked to and sometimes the conferences and so on, it's obviously an issue. It is because, as we know, there is no supranational body that is in charge of enforcing these laws, and then it really just comes to diplomacy and force and transactions. So I think that given the current order, we're probably far from having this supranational body as we used to. Perhaps just as bodies that we have had just from the current order. There may be some regional agreements, and that's probably something that we may see that just among countries, that on mutual benefit. But it really depends on who are the parties in those, and in some cases, some of the issues that you are mentioning just maybe between parties that are not necessarily willingly enter into an agreement. Of course, it depends on what. But it's still an open question. And at the same time, it's not clear whether just having this supranational body, just what kind of authority will they have to actually enforce something, just in the absence of a supra-state or something like that, that really has the power and the mandate to do something, and in which countries willingly agree to just to comply with that, is really hard to think about something like that. I think that probably we're going to continue to be seeing what we have seen in the past. Obviously, the dynamics are going to change because what we were talking about before, some of the commitment of some countries to support others and so on, maybe something that we may see some changes, but it's probably just kind of the same dynamic that we're seeing.
Okay. Before I let you go, let me ask, what brings you to our part of the world? You were in South Korea, and then you'll be leaving for Thailand. First of all, South Korea.
Thank you. In South Korea, we're having meetings with the Supreme Court and the Ministry of Justice to discuss the possibility of starting a program with South Korea. In the Philippines, we developed or organized a workshop to develop or to adapt a work that we have been doing to measure environmental rule of law, which we know we have talked about rule of law, but obviously just rule of law applies to a lot of different areas of the law. One that is quite important is environment, and to develop just new metrics on environmental rule of law with a lot of different partners, not only in the Philippines, but in Asia. Very productive. And then we're going to Thailand as well. We have some engagements there just with the Minister of Justice as well, and interesting commitments that the government has done towards advancing human rights and so on, to explore further collaborations.
Last question. When do we expect the 2025 Rule of Law Index to come out? This could be fourth quarter of the year?
Usually it's in October, the end of October. We're collecting the information now around the world. We're going to 143 countries.
We're adding one more.
Adding one more, that's right. And usually at the end of October.
Okay. Dr. Alejandro Ponce, Executive Director of the World Justice Project, thank you for such an illuminating and inspiring conversation.
Thank you very much, John.
That's it for us today. The next step for engaged citizens, as always, is to take a more active part in the democratic project. Please download the Rappler Communities app and join the chat room of your choice. Thank you. This is John Nery. See you in the public square.